There were a few groups in 1999 and 2000 that started to look at how back up even more. Up until the late 90s, people really thought that the only organs in the body that likely had stem cells were your skin, your GI tract, and your bone marrow, producing all the cells of your blood. And that's sort of where things sat for a while. My field is liver disease. Liver pathology is my clinical specialty. So I look at liver biopsies all day long, which for me is fun. I suppose kind of the same focus and concentration looking through a set of lenses as a sniper might experience. It's a contemplative sort of practice, you know. My team sort of was the one that confirmed that livers had their own stem cells, and human livers in particular. It wasn't just in animal experiments.
Okay.
But then to explain some of the data that had been produced over the prior few decades in animals, the human thing we were identifying where the stem cells hang in the liver didn't explain all that data. So we and others, for a variety of reasons, started looking at cells from the bone marrow. And it turned out that if you do a bone marrow transplant in mice, you can find the cells from the bone marrow, repopulate the new cells, replacing the bone marrow, repopulating the cells in the blood, but then winding up also as cells in the liver, in the brain, in the muscle. And so that was happening, like I said, 1999 to 2000.
Right.
And we were the first group to show that it happened in humans because we looked at men who had received female liver transplants and women who had received male bone marrow transplants and had liver biopsies for one reason or another. And so the difference between male cells and female cells is male cells have a Y chromosome and female cells do not. And so if you find a Y chromosome from a woman who had a male bone marrow transplant and you find a Y chromosome in a liver cell, that cell had to come from the bone marrow. And we did these experiments, usually using, hundreds of thousands or millions of cells to do the transplant. So people who were sort of opposed to this idea, because it broke a lot of dogma, cells from one organ shouldn't cross over to another organ. That was a very strict dogma for a century. They said what you needed was a single cell transplant, where you transplant one single bone marrow stem cell, not one type, but actually one single cell into the marrow of a recipient animal and see where that cell goes. And my colleague, Diane Krause at Yale, she and I had been working on this stuff, and we teamed up with Saul Sharkis, who was at Johns Hopkins back then. And he had a bunch of mice where he had accomplished this. It used to be very, very difficult to do a one-cell transplant. And when he was getting ready to look at how those cells populated the bone marrow, we said, hey, could we come down to Baltimore and quickly do some autopsies on your mice? And we did, and we took samples of all the tissues, and all the tissues had bone marrow-derived cells. And so that showed that one single adult stem cell could do everything an embryonic stem cell could do.
Wow.
And so that's how we got caught up in the politics of the stem cell stuff. And the thing with George Bush, he was trying to sort of split the difference between the anti-abortion lobby, which basically had the moral argument up until that point,
right,
but no scientific argument. And our work sort of provided them with the answer that, oh, you don't need to do embryonic stuff. You can, because adult cells can do everything.
Right.
And then the community split into sort of two factions. One was the adult stem cell folks like me, where we were like, you sort of have to examine everything in order to figure out what's going on here. It's too early to say what can do what. You need information from both. But the people who were rigidly trying to protect the embryonic stem cell research, their response wasn't that, hey, this is complicated. It was, no, they haven't proven adult cells can do everything, so we have to continue to do embryonic stem cell research, which is kind of a false argument too. There's sort of false arguments on both sides. And the result is that funding and the ability to publish the adult stem cell stuff was sort of squelched by those people trying to protect embryonic stem cell research. Ultimately, the way this played out is that because of research from both directions, the guy in Korea, whose name's escaping me at the moment, but he won the Nobel Prize for this, figured out that looking at what happens in embryonic stem cells and looking what happens in adult stem cells, he figured out how you could take any cell type, put it in a dish, give it a bunch of signaling molecules, and turn it into a stem cell that could do anything.
Wow.
Those are called induced pluripotent stem cells. And I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, that and cloning, those were the two things that got the Nobel Prize.
Right.
So, and that's where stem cell stuff has gone, which is awesome. The problem is that we still have very little in the way of stem cell derived therapies. And I think that's sort of a byproduct of the politics of everything that flared in the 20s. I'm hoping that this article in the Times signals the idea that, maybe a generation has passed. It's almost 20 years. And so the scientific prejudices and the political and the financial prejudices might start to lift. And maybe in the next 10 years, we'll start to see some stem cell promise finally.
Gosh, that's amazing.
One of those things where enough angry people have to die off before progress can be made.
Yeah, that's the third time this quote has come up today in my life. But yeah, my version of it, and this is like my favorite quote for the 20th century: "Progress happens one funeral at a time."
Damn.
Yeah.